There are yearly reports and books written on this, and my thesis doesn't attempt to remake that case. Like any colonial project, these realities are not uncontested, and while there are occasional exhibitions that strive to challenge colonialism at the museum, this reality cannot be ignored. My interest is in what happens when we bring work by marginalized Chicanx artists into the Contemporary Art Museum, specifically how museum practices perpetuate the further marginalization and misreading of this work. This presentation will demonstrate the need for a curatorial practice that considers how this work comes to be in the museum and what it encounters once it is there. What I mean by curative is healing, corrective, and restorative, and that, first and foremost, entails a reckoning with the embedded ideology of the museum. What is required then is a mediation of space, epistemology, and practice by museum staff in collaboration with the artists to equitably present work that exists at the margins of the Contemporary Art Museum. This is the Triton Museum of Art where I work, a contemporary art museum founded over 50 years ago in the city of Santa Clara. The subsequent images are of a couple of the galleries there. The embedded ideology that I speak of is not just a holdover from a colonial past evidenced by the architecture, design, and overall layout of space, but a set of expectations of how artwork should inhabit and hold that space, which then dictates the reception of that work from the moment it is selected and interpreted by the curator, conditioned by the registrar, installed by the preparator, and disseminated by the education department. What is in the space of a visibly empty gallery when you bring a work in? What is there is unseen, yet palpably felt, specifically by bodies of color that walk through and whose work might adorn those walls if just for a moment. What is at the center of the room is a dominant ideology that marginalizes people of color as visitors and outsiders. People of color can engage the museum as peripheral participants that are not intended to use the museum as a venue to share and teach their knowledge and worldview on their own terms. Chicana Spiritual Reflections was a project that I'd already been working on when I first began curating over 12 years ago. It finally opened at the Triton 4 years later in the spring of 2010. Although not my first curatorial project, this was the first exhibition that I worked on solely with Chicana artists, whose work specifically explored indigenous spirituality in their artistic practices. A broader theme looked at how this work complicated notions of identity for the Chicanx community. One of my goals was to engage in a discussion of how indigenismo and ceremonia manifested aesthetically in the culminating artwork. I learned a lot from this experience, and there are certainly things I would have done differently. However, the biggest takeaway for me at that time as a relatively new curator was during installation. Here are a series of slides to give you a sense of the space and how the exhibition was laid out. When you walk into the gallery, you first encounter glass artist Viva Paredes' work. In the background is Celia Herrera Rodriguez's watercolors and her installation Mitote. In this image, you can see Pilar Agüero Esparza's work on the upper left corner. Here's some more of Paredes' work with Mitote in the background. And the last slide has Consuelo Jimenez Underwood's wall installation and her weavings on the left. There were some powerful moments as each work went up. The room was transformed. My curatorial duties included lobbying for the use of certain material and taking responsibility for the way the work was brought in, because I had deep understanding of how the artist's practice informed the conceptual nature of the work. I was able to reflect much later on the visceral experience with each of these works as they were installed and how each piece transformed the space it filled, to get a clearer understanding of how the museum should meet the work. What is the museum's responsibility in preparing for this work? A small plume of white smoke rises up from the copal, disrupting the sterile environment of the galleries at the Triton Museum of Art. Copal is a tree resin sourced from the sap of a torchwood tree and is widely used throughout Mexico and the Americas. Predominantly used to cleanse, copal smudging is understood as preventative and curative. Its use dates back to pre-Columbian time. In this instance, the smudging is not part of a public ceremony. It is a private ritual to aid in the creation of Celia Herrera Rodriguez's work, Mitote. This is a fixed process that she replicates, regardless of the work being constructed or the environment in which it is being activated. At the museum, however, it is a cleansing of the institutional space in preparation for installation. The curative function of the copal and its use by Herrera Rodriguez for cleansing underscores the fraught history of indigenous artists and their representation in the Contemporary Art Museum. Celia Herrera Rodriguez is a Chicana Odami painter, performance, and installation artist whose work reflects a full generation of dialogue with Chicanx indigenous Mexican and North American native thought, spirituality, and politics. Her artistic practice is a rigorous remapping of indigenous thought for diasporic, detribalized Chicanx people. It is a realigning of contemporary art practice with the spiritual to reframe social, historical, political, and economic narratives that have shaped identity in the social consciousness of the Chicanx community. This remapping of a more complex understanding of identity formation harnesses memory through the incorporation of traditions that are functional, serving a specific purpose, intention, and prayer. Herrera Rodriguez's work is a looking through the rubble, remapping indigenous thinking that has endured. Mitote was inspired by the many ceremonial structures or god houses located in the mountains of Mexico. Those structures are rectangular and are built using mud and stone. They are used as a site for ceremonial rituals. In contrast, Herrera Rodriguez's structure here is built using willow from northern Mexico. Willow is used by many indigenous communities for its medicinal and healing properties. The title Mitote gives us some insight into the purpose of Herrera Rodriguez's structure. Mitote is a dance that is practiced by various indigenous communities across the Americas, bringing community together to envision and make manifest a communal understanding of how they want to live. Herrera Rodriguez's God House was not constructed to function as a ceremonial site. It is an exploration of an indigenous Chicanx futurity in diaspora. Celia Herrera Rodriguez, seen here on the left, was assisted by Zapotec artist Flor Crisostomo, pictured here on the right. Mitote was constructed using willow branches held together by fabric, twigs, and prayer ties. Prayer ties, seen here in this detail, are small pieces of paper tied with string, each holding an individual prayer of the maker, which are burned in offering. The prayer ties now hold tobacco, but in Mexica culture, they once held blood. Herrera Rodriguez explains that it is understood that our blood holds the spirit, so then ritual becomes a conversation with one's past, a conversation with the ancestors. Some of the prayer ties were assembled at the museum and burned in offering during installation. In the interior of the structure was a mesa, an altar-like arrangement on the ground used for healing and prayer. Mesas vary from altars in that they are portable, holding the necessary items for healing, ceremony, or prayer taking place away from the home. This mesa is constructed using mud, tying it to the land, with quadrants carved out representing the 4 directions. This construction is in juxtaposition to the traditional ambulatory nature of the mesa, as if it were brought and now taking root in a new space. Herrera Rodriguez placed an assortment of mundane items around the mesa, which included bottles, a blanket, tins, dried corns, and husks. She placed sticks, rocks, and other items that represent, hold, and embody the elements of water, fire, and earth, assembled to feed the spirit. It is important to understand how ceremony informs Herrera Rodriguez's artistic practice and how the spiritual is made material to understand the conceptual nature of her installation so that the visual analysis can be extended beyond the anthropological crutch often used by curators to misread this work. Curators' inability to do so is what subjects this work to narrow dialogues around authenticity and essentializing themes of race and identity that fail to present the historically grounded complexity of the Chicanx community. Herrera Rodriguez employs the spiritual as material, and that is crucial to understanding this work and the ceremonial functions for its installation and interpretation. Mitote was a challenge, both logistically and conceptually, for museum staff during installation. It required varying degrees of negotiation of space and material on my part with the chief curator and registrar to equitably present it. This process crystallized for me how museum policy can be leveraged by curators to perpetuate a standard of cultural legibility. Museum staff's cultural agency can greatly determine the plasticity of some of these policies. There was a need for me to serve as a cultural interpreter to make the case for keeping the ceremonial practices and use of certain materials intact. I would be remiss if I didn't address my agency as a Chicana and what that facilitated for my curatorial process and ultimately suggests about the limitations of efforts towards diversity and inclusion in museums where we are grossly underrepresented. My failures and successes during my work with these artists expose that diversity and inclusion alone cannot redress marginalization and misrepresentation at the Contemporary Art Museum. What is needed is a critical look at how museum practices perpetuate erasure and illegibility. How do we reinscribe white supremacy and further oppression in our practices? This is a question that all museum staff must wrestle with. There is a need for approaches that not only aim to increase and diversify attendance numbers, but that more importantly upend museums' tendencies to center white experiences and audiences. So what is needed is not just a demographic shift, but more importantly, an ideological one towards a curative model that can guide contemporary art museum practice by centering the epistemological contributions of artists and communities of color.